Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm here today to give a nice introduction to a very useful code editor um, called Visual Studio Code or VS
Recording.
Code, which is, sorry, Renee, is that everything okay? Sorry about that. Yes, so yeah, it's a very useful code editor that I prefer to use instead of the usual typical Jupyter notebook that most people are used to. And with that, so long I'll actually get started with sharing what I've got. So what I wanted to do today with this demonstration was to show from absolute scratch, absolute basics, that how to get started with this. So what you might remember from last week, if you've joined or if you've just got any coding experience with Jupyter Notebooks or Python or data science, is something that looks kind of like this. In a browser window, you've got your notebook with some markdown headings and some code cells. And while this is usually pretty good for most people, it's can be much better. And after this, you'll see why I can't really even go back to something like this because it's, yeah, not nearly as equipped as VS Code can be. So for this tutorial, I'm using a completely fresh virtual machine with nothing really installed from scratch. The only things that I have installed is um, Anaconda, which you can get from just Anaconda downloads if you want to start with that, or just a very basic Python interpreter. And from this, yeah, that's all you really need. That's all that I have installed on this machine and the notebook from last week to give a nice comparison. So from here, we can go to Visual Studio Code. You can Google it very simply, VS Code, Visual Studio Code, code, anything that's remotely similar. They make it very easy to find and very easy to get started with. It's basically just as simple as they say, a code editor. And it's not really to be confused with something as big and overwhelming and scary as it might seem, which is something like a IDE or integrated development environment, which has many, many, many tools and features. VS Code is essentially just a text editor, just the same as Microsoft Word or even the Notepad app on your computer. It's only used to edit text and then has some features built into it that make coding a lot more easy and convenient with it. But that is then up to the customization and how you can make it into an IDE and make it into something that's very, very powerful and very convenient to code with. But it can be as simple as you need it to be. So it's not really an overwhelming thing, which is a point that I want to stress, because when I've heard from a lot of people why they don't want to switch from Jupyter Notebook or from whichever code editor that they use to VS Code, it's because it can seem very overwhelming. Even in this picture on the website, it can seem very overwhelming to get started with, but it doesn't need to be at all. So just to give a bit more explanation of VS Code, is the state of the art, almost used everywhere in programming across all languages, because it is capable of editing with a lot of good insight into almost every coding language you can think of. Built by Microsoft, fully open source, runs everywhere, is very compatible with everything. Even here, it is absolutely fully open source on GitHub, all the code available for you to have a look at. Yeah, written in TypeScript, owned by Microsoft. It is, yeah, it's by coders for coders. So to get started with, yeah, on the very front of the website, you just have to click yeah and download for whichever operating system you're on, either Mac, Windows, or Linux. There's probably also some easier ways in Linux or Apple or Mac OS to get started from app stores, maybe even on the Microsoft App Store or something like that. Or even I think in the Anaconda Navigator, there is an option to download VS Code, but here's a very basic and easy version to get started. And so far, I've downloaded that already here. Just the user setup, so I can go through it step by step with you to show that it's really a very easy process to get started with VS Code. So from here, we'll go fully from scratch. So sorry if there's a few blank moments of loading time. To get started, accept the agreements, install in any spot that you would like. Yeah, we can just skip through installation, very easy. The defaults are very good, all you really need. and you'll see it goes quite quickly. It's very, very easy to set up. If anything, it's going a little bit slowly because I'm working on a virtual machine, which is much slower, but on your laptop or computer, it should be very, very quick. Within a few minutes, it's up and running and with all you need, really. Yeah, just like that, we can be finished and launch. I think it's slowly booting up. Sorry, it is a bit slow because it's a virtual machine. Yeah, and upon introduction, when you first open VS Code, it should be something like this, a very basic welcome screen. Might pop up with some suggestions to start with Windows subsystem for Linux, but we won't worry about that for now. For now, this whole tutorial is a very simple walkthrough of just getting started with it and just getting installed, starting it up, and running a very simple Jupyter notebook. So from here, it gives you a very simple interface to create new things or to open folders and files that you already have. You can already connect to remote development workspaces if you want to SSH into another machine, but that's even beyond what we really need for now. For now, all we need to do is to come over here to open folder to get started with whichever coding folder you have. For this example, I'm going to go to what we had from last week from the micro-school on Introduction to Matplotlib. And it'll ask you about just trusting the code so that you can interact with it. And right here, we can open the file, and there you have it. Just the same as the desktop, I mean the browser version. And here, a very first good introduction is it already knows that it's just a text editor, so it has nothing really to support coding in it just yet. It's just as good as opening Notepad, but it offers an extension because it can tell that we're working in a Jupyter notebook working with Python, that we need it's Python IntelliSense, which is its code linter that basically looks at all of the details of Python so that it can tell apart when you importing something, when you're using something, when you're defining a function. It understands what you're trying to write and can give you a lot of insight into that. And I'll show you more what I mean with that now. But for now, we can just come over here to install. It'll open the extensions tab, which is this little box here. I will show you some more extensions, very useful ones now. But for now, we need the basic Python extension, which you can read through all of this, gives you a lot of useful features. Sorry again for the slowness of the install. It should be much quicker on your machine, but this is just again because I'm using a virtual machine, so it's very low compute power, which again goes to show that it is possible to use this on any system that you like, even if you have a very old and very slow running laptop, then it can still be very useful. While we're at it, while we wait, there's another very good extension that we will need that makes it possible to run Jupyter notebooks. And in the marketplace, we can just come over here and search for whatever extension we'd like. For this example, Jupyter, and right here by Microsoft, very good Jupyter notebook support. You can just click install, and you can read through the documentation of what this extension does on the page here. And you go through any extensions that you would like. There are really limitless extensions that you can customize VS Code with, and to make it however you like, however you want to suit your workflow or anything that you would really like to do with it. That's what makes it so useful and versatile, is that you can make it into however you want. Yeah, it's not as constrained or limited as something like the browser notebook, and it is not as heavily structured as typical IDE like PyCharm or Spider or NetBeans or something, but it can truly be made to be your own. Now that's installed. I think the Python one is still slowly installing. And if anyone is watching along with this, I encourage you to follow along with the steps I've done so far, just so it's much easier for you to get started and get rolling immediately with the very next code file that you open. Yeah, to kill some of the time while we wait. But yes, okay, now it's installed and has some nice suggestions for you, but we already know we're going to be working with this file. And now we have the Python extension and Jupyter Notebook extension, and that's all we really need for running notebooks like this so far, but we can add some more stuff later if we like. Now, an important part with the Jupyter notebooks is this is still all just a text editor, and while it has the Python extensions and the Jupyter Notebook extensions, it still isn't fully interlinked with the Python that you have. Or if you have an Anaconda environment or a virtual environment or different Python interpreters, it's not fully linked yet. So what we have to do here is it'll prompt you as soon as you try to run it, or you'll see even here the little squiggly lines show that it doesn't understand what it's pointing at, because it doesn't have a Python interpreter that it knows to use to look for these things. So we can come over here, or it'll prompt you as soon as you try run to select the Python kernel that we want to use. And you can use an existing Jupyter server if you've already got one up and running, but more likely you'll just select one from a Python environment. Then it'll come up with a list of all the different Python interpreters that you have on your computer. Here are two Anaconda examples, one just the base example and one environment that I created just to show what I mean. And an even nicer way that makes it very cool to make environments specifically to whichever project you're working on is you can create a Python environment here, where you can create either a virtual environment or an Anaconda environment, depending on which way you prefer. And it will create that in the workspace that you're currently in. But for consistency with what we have from the previous example with the matplotlib tutorial, I'll select the same environment from there. And for here, it'll ask something about firewalls, just to be sure. So it can access all of your Anaconda environments if you use Anaconda, or if you just prefer to use a basic Python interpreter. And now from here, what I want to do is to just open the window again, just to let it fully incorporate that it has an environment now. I can start to analyze the code. And here you can see that already that there's a difference, that things are being highlighted in a different way that show it's a bit more interactive, and the code editor knows a bit better what actually all of these different things are. And for an example, just to quickly go back to what we had in the Jupyter Notebook in the browser that you might be more familiar with, is there is a little bit of syntax highlighting, but not really that much, more just the generic ones of if it's a number, if it's a method that's being, or attribute that's being accessed in dot notation, equal sign, or an import functionality. But here you can see I can hover over the words and they mostly just words. But here in VS Code, if I hover over NumPy, then it comes up with this little dialog that is the full documentation of NumPy that can say all that it's about, explain all the different ways to use it, and so on. And same here with matplotlib. I hover over it, and it gives me the full front page documentation of matplotlib, which is immediately already a much better experience than just using a sort of dumbed down notebook in a browser window. And that continues even into then all of the functions that you might use. Like here, if I'm trying to start, I need to create an array using numpy.linspace. If I hover here over linspace, then I can see the exact documentation of it. And the docstring explains exactly what it does, what parameters it takes, gives what it returns, and examples. Everything that you would usually want to go to the documentation to go and see, it's got right here built in just by hovering over it. Yes, so now I guess we can get started running with it. And one thing that I also just want to show quickly is how if I try and run this cell without doing the imports first, it'll obviously give me an error. But just to show some of the errors, is it makes it much nicer to also be able to navigate around errors. That if it says here the typical error that you would get, the same as you would in any Python file, any interactive notebook, yeah, it just also makes it much easier to jump around the notebook into exactly finding where the error might be. And it says here in line 1 that there's the error that np is not defined. So we can then run it in here. And also a very nice feature of VS Code is by default, it has this code timer. So that you can see if a certain cell takes a very long time to run, then you can see exactly how long. And I don't believe that's a feature in typical Jupyter notebooks, or at least hasn't been since I was using it. It was very new to me to see this in VS Code, and a very, very useful feature. But now I can see it here. It took exactly 19.3 seconds to import the files. And I can also from here, I guess we can run the whole notebook. I just up here at the stop button to run all the cells sequentially. And then if I'm wondering where exactly the cell is that's busy running, I can jump to that cell using this go to function. That just makes it very convenient to not have to scroll through my notebook to find out what I'm doing or which cell is running if I've run the whole notebook, but I can just jump to the specific cell that's being used. And that makes it much, much more convenient to be able to jump around in the notebook. Which also brings me to this idea of the outline, where if you've structured things in your notebook that with the cells of the markdown files and the markdown cells with the headings and the subheadings and so on, then it can be very easy to use this outline feature that I can make as big as I like. And if I say I want to go see what the 3D plots was, instead of scrolling around looking for that, I can just jump straight to that heading. And if I want to go right back to the beginning, then I can just jump straight back to that. So as you can see, it makes it very, very easy to just navigate around your notebook and to see actually what's going on with your code. And that's also, not to mention, the very, very nice autocomplete. So if I want to do something with NumPy, but I can't exactly remember the function that I wanted to do, but I remember it was something along the lines of lin something. And then I can see, oh, linspace, and then autocomplete very nicely for me. And then, like I say, if I open it and I forget how linspace works, then this pops up here that tells me exactly how it works. Of the docstring, of the parameters, what they're supposed to be like, and I'll keep scrolling down, and there I can see perfect examples of how I should use it. So there I can see, okay, type in like this example. And there I have my array. So it immediately makes it much, much simpler just to use the exact same file that we had been using before. And you can get a lot more out of it as well. Like in the previous example, there was the idea of saving your plots. But if you forgot to add the line of saving a figure, but you don't want to go through and run all the code again, here, as you see, as I hover over the figure, then these little buttons pop up where I can copy the picture to my clipboard. I can view it in another tab here, or I can just save the figure directly, however I like, into whichever saved dialogue that I could want it to be in, which makes it much nicer. And Another very important feature that typical Jupyter notebook doesn't really have, or at least hides very well, is the ability to not just use Jupyter notebooks, but also use Python in conjunction with that. Like if, for example, your code has become a bit more complex, then you might have your own Python files or your own little Python package that is based on a lot of classes and functions that you will reuse. But that can't really be done very nicely in Jupyter without just adding it all into new cells. But you can fully separate that into a different Python file. So here I can right click, or even just here at the top, click new file. Just for an example, I'll make a new Python file. And immediately it can tell that it's supposed to be in Python. And I can do the very basic hello world Python, and even there it tells me exactly how to use the print functionality. And just from here, I can choose the interpreter that I want to use so it's consistent. Otherwise, it's going to pick the default base version that I have. I can set it back to the Conda environment that we were using before. And just from here, I can run my Python file simply within the notebook. It'll open up a terminal. It'll call the Python interpreter and run it on this file. It's not always this slow. Like I say, this is because I'm using a virtual machine. But very quickly it'll do that and it'll print my output just like that in the file. And let's say then I make it much more complicated and I have all of my classes and functions in this separate file that I want to use in my notebook, but I don't want to jump between them all the time. Right here next to the run Python file, there's a split editor button. I can click that, and then right here I'll have my Python file side by side with my Jupyter notebook without opening any more browser tabs or anything more complicated than that, but it's all right here in front of you. And you can use the terminal however you like to do any other terminal applications that you would want to. And it's very easy to open it and close it with hotkeys of control tilde opens and closes the terminal. So it makes it much, much easier to do all of the rest of the coding things that you might need to do. That's not just as limiting as a Jupyter notebook. Because what I noticed is in a Jupyter notebook, you feel like you can only work with the cells. That I also didn't really know how to use a terminal, how to use basic Python files, how to even run a Python file, until using VS Code more and more. Then it becomes very clear how to use all these things and opens up a whole new realm of working with the code that you have. And it makes it very, very easy and very encouraged to be doing that. So I think that's all to cover for now. There's much, much more that VS Code can do. It makes it very easy to debug your code and to integrate with source control and Git and GitHub to take away all of the difficulty of trying to learn command line interfaces and go around in a very confusing way, but get that VS Code makes it very, very simple to go about all of that. And I know another good feature of this is to make it look very nice. Like over here, you can come to settings and your theme and your color theme, and you can choose from all sorts of different looks that you could want for the way you want your editor to be. You can also then find there are very, very many on the extension marketplace. For example, not sure how nice and easy it is to get lost in the customization loop of, I can go to the typical Dracula theme, which is a very popular one. Very quickly install that and then change the way that our code looks altogether so that you really can customize it however you like. That just like this, it already looks much more appealing than something as simple as a browser Jupyter notebook. And from here, it's really limitless, and you never have to go back to a very basic version of Jupyter Notebook in a browser again, because you have everything that you can need here. And it's also not just for Jupyter Notebooks or for Python. For example, if you want to write something in R, it's very easy to go into the extension marketplace, just search for R, and then it'll come up with the extension that you need, and then it's an IDE for all you could want to do in R. Do the same with Julia, or even something like MATLAB. There are all the extensions that you could possibly need to make it customize however you want for whichever programming languages you want. There's ways to integrate it with SQL databases. There's ways to remotely connect into through SSH into a remote host, so that you could run code on the CHPC or something like that, for example. So there's yes, I see now in the chat also GitHub Copilot, which is very, very useful and very easy to integrate with VS Code. That I can save for another example, but that is also, if you have GitHub Copilot, an account for that is as easy as just searching the extension marketplace for GitHub, and right here your Copilot is immediately there. And as you type along, then it will show up as a autocomplete text for you, which, as far as I know, you can't get at all in a browser Jupyter Notebook. And for also a good thing about GitHub Copilot is you can get a student developer pack from GitHub, which includes GitHub Copilot for free if you sign up with your student account. So if you want to look around for that, it's a very, very useful tool. And I think that covers mostly everything that I wanted to talk about. So if there are any questions or any other comments or anything that you'd like to know, then I'd be happy to answer them now.
Okay, I see we have a hand, Tasman. Let me just, would you like to type your question or would you like to ask it? Let me quickly give you permission. Anybody else, please type your questions or put up your hands, please. Oh, there we go. Tasman, you should be able to ask your questions online now. Anybody else, if you have questions, you can so long put up your hands and we give you an opportunity.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm all right. My apologies, I came late, but I'll just try and catch the recording. I recently just got the Visual Studio. I think it's the commercial version because I bought a license. So I just wanted to know where to start and linking everything else because I also use Python a lot. So I use Anaconda, and so is it better to run it in VS or maybe just Anaconda using what you call this? We're using the libraries in in Anaconda, for example, like for TensorFlow and stuff like that.
Okay, so I hear you mention Visual Studio and that you mentioned commercial license and all of that. I think Visual Studio is the bigger IDE that's used mostly, I think, for C# coding because it's a very Microsoft thing. VS Code is the text editor version, which is much easier to get started with the extensions of just Python and Jupyter Notebook. That's just in the extension marketplace, and then you can start in a notebook just the same with the same Python interpreter and Conda environment that you have already been using. Where it's also very easy to get started with things like you mentioned, TensorFlow, of just searching or just Conda install TensorFlow in your environments as you typically would from the command line. But Visual Studio Code is, I think, the one that you're looking for because that is more applicable to any programming language that you want. But I think Visual Studio is more focused on C# coding and not as much Python. I think it's a bit trickier to use Python in that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure, hope that helps.
Dean, I see there's a question from Arthur. I put it in the chat. Could you briefly demonstrate how to use Git for version control while in Visual Studio? Is that applicable here, or is that something else we need to? Oh, and by the way, thanks for all the answers that people gave about future micro schools that we can present. Thanks for the feedback.
Sure. So for version control in Visual Studio, I think it'd be better with a bigger and longer micro school, but for the first example, it can be just from this third option on the side here, where, okay, on this virtual machine, I don't have it, but to get started with Git, and then it would ask you for the remote repository, or you can link it then with your GitHub account, that you can connect Visual Studio Code with a GitHub account, and then link the repositories directly in here, and then it'll give you the options, the very typical ones of being able to pull, fork, push, commit, sync, of all the typical GitHub ones right in this little menu here. And you can get extensions that make it a bit easier. For example, Git Lens is one that makes it much, much more detailed and interactive to do all of the version control things that you could possibly want within this as your graphical user interface, that it's not from the just all from the command line. But yeah, just from going to the source control tab and connecting everything of starting up with Git and connecting your GitHub account, it should be quite straightforward, but we will offer, I imagine, a follow-up micro school on using that. And I hope that answers the question for now.
Okay, do we have any other burning issues? Definitely seems like this concept is a good concept, this micro schools, for us to give things that are really applicable. Okay, I think let's end it off here, and then please, anytime, just email us, give us feedback, give us information of future micro schools that you would like us to do. Dean, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you very much for presenting this. Thank you for your time in preparing, and keep well, and thank you for attending today, and we stay in touch. And please, if you're not on our mailing list already, please join as soon as possible. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.